The moment Richard Anderson laughed at me across that boardroom table, I made a decision. Not an emotional one. Not the kind a man makes when his face is hot and his hands are shaking. The quiet kind. The kind that comes after you've spent 12 years building something so precise, so completely invisible to the people who were supposed to love you, that by the time they finally see it, it's already too late for them to do anything but watch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't leave the room. I sat there, let him finish laughing, nodded once, and slid my phone under the table. The text I sent took 11 seconds to type. Anderson Holdings was a $50 million company. The emergency board meeting they called started 9 minutes and 40 seconds later. I know because I checked the time. Let me start from the beginning. Because if I don't, you won't understand why I felt nothing when it happened. Not guilt, not satisfaction. Just a kind of clean, final rightness, the way a knot feels when it finally comes loose after you've been pulling at it for years and years. My name is Alexander Reeves. I'm 37 years old. I'm a managing partner and chief investment officer at Reeves Capital Group, based in Atlanta, Georgia. We manage a private equity portfolio that currently sits just north of $340 million. We have offices in Buckhead, a second team in Charlotte, and a research division that operates out of a suite on West Peachtree that I personally renovated 3 years ago because I wanted the light to come in from the east in the mornings. I tell you all of this not to impress you. I tell you because in about 4 minutes of listening to this story, you're going to need to understand that Richard Anderson had every opportunity to find out who I was. He just never bothered. I met Sophia at an art fundraiser at the High Museum in Midtown Atlanta about 6 years ago. She was standing near a Romer beard in peace, wearing a green dress, holding a glass of wine she kept forgetting to drink. She was the kind of woman who drew a room's attention without seeming to notice it, and when she finally looked over and caught me staring, she didn't look away first. I liked that about her immediately. We dated for 8 months before I met her family. That should have told me something. Richard Anderson built Anderson Holdings from a regional construction and commercial real estate firm that his own father started in the 1970s in Columbia, South Carolina. By the time Sophia and I started dating, Richard had grown it significantly. Commercial developments across the Southeast, a few mixed-use projects in Charlotte and Raleigh, a shopping corridor development deal in Savannah that had been in negotiation for about 3 years. He was a big man in small rooms. That's the only way I know how to say it. Everywhere Richard went, he made sure the room knew he had arrived. His wife, Claudette, was the kind of woman who had learned to smile at everything her husband said, even when he was wrong, which was often. Their son, Brett, was 29 and worked in business development for Anderson Holdings, which in practice meant he drove a company car, attended meetings he didn't prepare for, and told people at cocktail parties that he was in real estate. The first time I had dinner at their home in Lake Murray, South Carolina, a big colonial on the water with a boathouse Richard mentioned 4 times unprompted, Richard shook my hand, looked me over the way a man does when he's already decided something, and said, "Sophia tells me you work in investments." He said it the way someone might say you work at the mall. I told him I ran a private equity firm. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they've heard a word they recognize but don't want to admit they don't fully understand. "Boutique operation?" he asked. "We manage about $280 million at the time," I said. "Growing." He smiled, not unkindly, but with the particular condescension of a man who has decided the number you said isn't real yet. "That's good for you," he said. "Takes time to build something real." I looked at him. I looked at the boathouse behind him. I said, "Yes, sir, it does." And I left it at that. Sophia and I got married 14 months later at the Barnsley Gardens Resort in Adairsville, Georgia. It was a beautiful wedding. I paid for the majority of it because Richard offered to contribute and then kept, finding reasons why the timing wasn't ideal. Sophia said it didn't matter. I said it didn't matter. But I noticed. If you've been with us for a while, do one quick thing right now. Hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. And leave a comment below, tell us where you're watching from. This one is going to take you somewhere. I promise. The first 2 years of our marriage were good. Sophia was a marketing director at a healthcare consulting firm in Atlanta. She was sharp, driven, and she had this ability to read a room that I always admired. I thought that clarity extended to her family. I was wrong about that part. Richard called me directly for the first time in June of our second year of marriage. Not to check in, not to have a conversation. He called because Anderson Holdings was facing a liquidity problem on the Savannah development. The deal had stalled. Their primary lender had gotten cautious, some regulatory issue with the project site that their attorneys hadn't fully vetted before closing. They needed bridge capital, and they needed it fast, or 3 years of negotiation, and $4 million in pre-development costs were going to vanish. He asked if I knew anyone. I want to be very precise about what he asked. He said, "Do you know anyone who might be interested in a short-term bridge position?" Not, "Could you help?" Not, "Would you consider?" He said, "Do you know anyone?" As if I was a referral service. As if calling his son-in-law for help was something he could distance himself from by phrasing it like a professional inquiry. I told him I would make some calls. I made no calls. Instead, I had my team run a full analysis of the Savannah project within 48 hours. We looked at the site, the regulatory exposure, the lender relationships, the project timeline, the comparable development deals in the Chatham County market. By the end of that week, I came back to Richard with a formal proposal. Reeves Capital would provide the bridge financing. We'd take a limited equity stake in the project, structured as preferred equity, which would protect our position, and we'd attach conditions around the regulatory resolution timeline. It was a fair deal. It was frankly a generous deal. Most bridge lenders in that situation would have demanded a higher rate and a larger stake. I was making it easier for them because Sophia loved her family, and I understood what the Savannah project meant to them. Richard reviewed the proposal for 11 days. Then he called me back. "We've decided to go a different direction," he said. "What direction?" I asked. He told me he'd found a private lender through a business associate of his. I asked about the terms. He was vague in the way people are when the terms are worse than what they were offered and don't want to admit it. He said, "We appreciate you looking at it, Alexander." And then he said, "Family's family, but business is business. You understand." Sophia told me not to take it personally. I told her I didn't. I did. Not because he chose someone else. That's his right. But because of the phrase, "Family's family, but business is business." It was a philosophy. A clean division. His family, his business. Me, I was something else. Adjacent. Useful maybe, in certain contexts, but not really inside the circle. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Over the next 3 years, that philosophy expressed itself in dozens of small ways that individually meant nothing, and together meant everything. Richard and Claudette would come to Atlanta to visit, and the conversation at dinner was always Anderson Holdings. The Savannah deal, which eventually closed after 18 months of additional delays. The Charlotte project. Brett's role in the company, which expanded in title without expanding in responsibility. Sophia would ask about my work, and I would start to explain something, and Richard would nod the way people do when they're waiting for their turn to speak. Once, at Thanksgiving at their Lake Murray house, I mentioned that we'd just closed a significant acquisition, a manufacturing technology company based in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a deal we'd been working on for 7 months, one of the better exits I'd structured in 2 years. Richard looked up from his plate, nodded once, and said, "Good. You need to keep building that track record." As if he were my mentor, as if I had been a mid-level analyst who'd just gotten his first deal done. I was 35 years old. I had a track record that most people in his industry would have found humbling. Sophia touched my hand under the table. I smiled. I ate my food. I thought about the number in the Reeves Capital portfolio at that exact moment, which I will not share with you here because that's not the point. The point is that I sat across from a man who had decided what I was and was completely uninterested in being corrected. The invitation to the Anderson Holdings board meeting came through Sophia, which was the first thing that should have warned me about what was coming. Richard was expanding. He'd been approached about a major mixed-use development project in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. $400 million project, residential towers, commercial space, ground floor retail, a hotel component. Significant. The kind of project that would triple Anderson Holdings' footprint overnight. The problem was the capital stack. To participate at the level Richard wanted, Anderson Holdings needed a major equity partner. Someone with institutional relationships, access to LP capital, and the kind of credibility that made large pension funds and family offices take a meeting. He needed exactly what I did for a living. Sophia mentioned the project over dinner at our apartment in Buckhead in early March. She was excited. She said her father had been thinking about it for months, that he'd asked whether I might be interested in being involved, in a formal capacity. She said it like it was a gift, like he was finally opening the door. I asked how it came up. She said he'd called her. He hadn't called me. He'd called her, and she'd served as the intermediary, which told me the way Richard thought about this had not changed even slightly. I was still someone you went through Sophia to reach. I told her I was interested in hearing more. The meeting was at Anderson Holdings headquarters in Columbia, South Carolina, a corner office on the 14th floor of a building on Main Street, with a view of the Congaree River if you tilted your head slightly to the left. Richard sat at the head of the table. Brett sat to his right, wearing a suit that fit well and holding a pen he never used. A woman named Patricia, who I gathered was their CFO, sat with a folder of documents. And there was a man named Garrett Walsh, who Richard introduced as their financial advisor, a title that covered a wide range of competence levels in my experience. Sophia sat beside me, which I appreciated. Richard opened the meeting by presenting the Nashville project. He was a good presenter when the subject was his own work. He had the practiced confidence of someone who'd sold himself in rooms his whole career. He talked about the site, the developer they were partnering with, the market fundamentals, the projected returns. It was a solid pitch for someone who didn't know what questions to ask. I knew what questions to ask. When he finished, I asked about the capital structure. He deferred to Garrett, who explained it in general terms. I asked more specific questions about the waterfall, about the preferred equity position, about how senior debt was being sourced and whether they had any pre-commitments from institutional lenders. Garrett answered some of them. Patricia answered others with more precision. Brett wrote something on his notepad that I suspected was not related to the meeting. Then Richard asked me to walk them through what an involvement from Reeves Capital would look like. I did. I spent 15 minutes explaining exactly how we would structure our participation, the size of the capital commitment I could source within 90 days, the LP relationships we had that were specifically interested in Southeast and Mid-South development plays, the way I could bring credibility to the institutional piece of the capital stack that would allow them to access lower-cost senior debt. I was thorough. I was specific. I had run the numbers on the back end of my own analysis before the meeting. When I finished, Richard leaned back in his chair. He looked at Garrett. Then he looked at me, and he smiled the same smile I had seen at every family dinner for 4 years. The one that said he'd already decided something before I walked in the room. "Alexander," he said, "what you're describing sounds like a meaningful contribution to a project of this scale." He paused. "But I want to be straightforward with you. We're looking for a partner at the $50 million commitment level, institutional scale, someone with the balance sheet to anchor the equity raise." He tilted his head. "That's a different conversation than what Reeves Capital typically handles, isn't it?" I looked at him for a moment. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, calmly, genuinely curious to hear how he would say it. "Well," Richard said, spreading his hands on the table in a generous gesture, "your firm does good work. But this is a $50 million business we're building here, a different tier." Sophia went completely still beside me. I heard Brett shift in his chair. Patricia looked at her folder. I said, "Richard, I manage $340 million in assets under management right now. My LP network includes institutional relationships, capable of providing the full capital commitment you're describing and more. I've structured deals of this size and larger." Richard nodded, the same way he always nodded. Not hearing, processing, looking for the version of what I said that fit his existing framework. Then he looked at Garrett and back at me, and he did the thing that I will carry with me for the rest of my professional life. He laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Not theatrical. Just the easy, dismissive laugh of a man who has decided that what you've said is charming, but not quite serious. "Alexander," he said, "we appreciate you being here. Sophia tells me you've built something over there. But we don't need pocket change on a deal like this. Come back to us when you've got institutional weight behind you." He looked at Garrett. "Let's talk about the Whitmore Group timeline after lunch." And that was it. I was excused. The meeting continued around me. Brett uncapped his pen. Patricia opened her folder. Sophia's hand found my knee under the table, but I had already moved somewhere else entirely. Somewhere very quiet. Very still. I looked at Richard Anderson across the table, and I made my decision. I slid my phone out under the edge of the table and sent a single text to my investment manager, Daniel Fitch. "Withdraw all existing backing from Anderson Holdings. Freeze the preliminary commitment letter for the Nashville project. Do not process anything further until I call you. Move immediately." 9 words, more or less. I sent it at 1:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in Columbia, South Carolina. The emergency board meeting at Anderson Holdings started at approximately 1:56. I should tell you about Daniel Fitch because he's important to this story. Daniel has been with Reeves Capital for 6 years. He came out of Goldman's infrastructure desk, which means he can read a capital structure the way a surgeon reads imaging. He is also a man of extraordinary discretion, which is why I have trusted him with the kind of information that makes other people nervous. When I sent him that text, I knew 2 things. First, he would execute immediately, because that is what Daniel does. Second, he would understand exactly what I was doing and why, because Daniel had been in our preliminary discussions about the Anderson Holdings Nashville engagement for 3 weeks. What Richard Anderson did not know, because he had never once asked, was that Reeves Capital had been quietly pre-positioning as the lead equity arranger on the Nashville project for 22 days before that board meeting. Daniel had sent the preliminary term sheet to Patricia's office 2 weeks prior. We had been in ongoing contact with the developer, a firm called Summit Meridian based in Brentwood, Tennessee, about Reeves Capital's formal role. We had LPs and preliminary conversations about the commitment. We were, in the language of the industry, soft-circled. What that means in plain terms, we were the ones holding the project together on the financial side. Without our participation, the capital stack did not exist. The Nashville deal did not happen. Richard knew we were involved. He had asked Sophia to reach out to me. He had invited me to the meeting. What he had apparently not done was ask anyone to actually explain what that involvement meant. He had asked Garrett Walsh, a man whose qualifications I had assessed within the first 15 minutes of that meeting, and Garrett had apparently not read the documents Daniel had sent to Patricia, or Patricia had not shown them to Garrett, or Richard had made up his mind about me before. Any of this happened, and the meeting was theater. A formality. A way of being able to tell Sophia he had given me a chance. I'm not certain which. It doesn't change the outcome. I left the meeting at 2:04. Sophia followed me into the hallway. She touched my arm. Her face was a conflict I recognized. She knew what had happened. She had sat next to me. She had heard every word. And she was her father's daughter in ways she had never fully examined, which meant that even now, in this hallway, I could see her deciding how to frame it so that the damage was smaller than it was. "He didn't mean it the way it sounded," she said. I looked at her for a moment. "Sophia," I said, "how long has your father known what I do for a living?" She looked away. "Alex, 4 years," I said, not angry, just precise. "He's had 4 years to ask one question about my work. He never did." She didn't have an answer for that. She had the expression she wore when she understood something she didn't want to understand. I kissed her forehead and told her I needed to make some calls. She went back into the meeting room. I took the elevator to the lobby. Standing on Main Street in Columbia, with the February light coming off the Congaree River a few blocks east, I called Daniel. "It's done," Daniel said before I could speak. The preliminary commitment letter has been retracted. Summit Meridian has been notified that our engagement is on hold pending a strategic review. I've also flagged it with Jennifer at Carolina's Institutional Partners. They were going to co-anchor with us. Good, I said. Alexander, Daniel said, and I could hear the particular tone he used when he was being professionally careful. Summit Meridian is not going to be happy. No, I agreed. They're not. They're going to call Anderson directly. Yes, I said. They are. The call from Summit Meridian came to Richard Anderson's office at 2:43 that afternoon. I know because Sophia called me at 3:07, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone standing in a building where something has gone wrong and everyone is trying to figure out what. Their lead developer, a man named Carter Webb, had called Richard personally. The message was straightforward. Summit Meridian had been relying on Reeves Capital's equity arrangement to anchor the Nashville project's institutional raise. Without that arrangement, the entire capital structure was in question. The project's timeline could not be maintained. They needed clarification immediately on what had changed. Richard called me at 3:19. I let it ring. He called again at 3:24. I let it ring again. Not because I was punishing him, because I was in the middle of a call with Jennifer Hollister at Carolina's Institutional Partners, who had $40 million in soft-circled commitment to the Nashville project and needed to understand what her options were. The third call from Richard came at 3:51. By that point, I was back in my car, driving north on I-26 toward Charlotte, where I had a dinner meeting with a portfolio company. I answered. Alexander. His voice was different, not the smooth boardroom voice. Something underneath it, something that needed to be managed and wasn't quite managing itself. Richard, I said. A pause. I understand there's been some confusion with the capital arrangement on the Nashville project. There's no confusion on my end, I said. Another pause. Longer. Carter Webb tells me that Reeves Capital has withdrawn from the engagement. That's correct. A silence that had a temperature to it. Why? I drove north. The afternoon light was flat and cold across the upstate South Carolina landscape. I watched a flock of birds cross the highway ahead of me in a long diagonal line. Richard, I said, you told me today that this was a $50 million business and that you didn't need my pocket change. I agreed with you, so I removed my pocket change. A very long silence. That's not what he started. It's exactly what you said, I said. I was at the table. Alexander, I was speaking about the scale of the deal. I manage $340 million in assets under management, I said. I've told you that. You've heard me say that. Today, at that table, in front of your CFO and your financial advisor and your son and my wife, you laughed at me, and then you moved on to the next agenda item. I paused. I decided to take your advice and leave the big deals to the people with institutional weight. A silence so complete I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. We need to talk, Richard said finally. His voice had lost something. I couldn't name it exactly. The ease of it. The certainty. I'm available Thursday, I said. I'll have Daniel send you a calendar invite. And I hung up. I want to tell you something about the next 36 hours, because I think it reveals more about what I had actually built than anything that came before it. Summit Meridian began calling Anderson Holdings every 3 hours. The Nashville project's timeline was structured around a financing close date of approximately 90 days. Without the equity arrangement that Reeves Capital had been anchoring, the institutional investors who had been in preliminary discussions began to pull back. Carolina's Institutional Partners put their commitment on formal hold. A family office out of Dallas that Daniel had brought in early went radio silent. The developer began exploring whether the project timeline could be extended, which triggered a conversation with the landowner about carrying costs that no one wanted to have. Anderson Holdings had spent 14 months and significant internal resources positioning for the Nashville deal. Brett had apparently given several presentations internally about the project. Richard had used it as the centerpiece of a growth strategy that he'd shared with his own board of advisors. All of it was predicated on a capital structure that Reeves Capital had been building quietly for 3 weeks, while Richard treated me like a man who had come to the wrong table. The Thursday call happened as scheduled. Richard drove up to Atlanta. He did not call Sophia first. He did not ask to meet at their home. He called Daniel's number and asked for 30 minutes at our offices on West Peachtree. I want to tell you what our offices look like, because I think it matters. The Reeves Capitol Suite on West Peachtree in Buckhead is not the flashiest space in Atlanta. It doesn't need to be. It's a full floor of a building that has a specific kind of quiet to it, the kind that comes from good materials and very few unnecessary things. The eastern windows run floor to ceiling, and in the morning the light comes in clean and gold across the hardwood floors. There is a reception desk made of white oak. There are no trophies on the wall. There's a board in the conference room where Daniel maintains a live view of our portfolio, color-coded by performance tier, updated every morning. It is the room of a man who has been doing this for 12 years and stopped needing to explain himself somewhere around year 7. I was in that conference room when they brought Richard up. He walked in the way a man does when a room has done something unexpected to him. He stopped at the doorway for just a moment, the way Sophia sometimes did, taking in the view, the space, the board. Then he walked to the table and sat down across from me. I had Daniel with me. No one else. "Thank you for coming up," I said. Richard looked at the board. He looked at Daniel. He looked back at me. Something had shifted in his face. Not everything. He was still Richard Anderson, but some of the easy authority had moved somewhere else. "I owe you an apology," he said. I waited. "What I said at the meeting," he continued, "was not an accurate reflection of your capabilities. I was speaking loosely. I should have been more careful. You laughed," I said. Quietly, not unkindly. He held my gaze. I did. "In front of your CFO, in front of your son, in front of Sophia." A pause. "Yes." I let that sit for a moment. "Richard," I said, "I've been married to your daughter for 4 years. In that time, I have never asked you for anything. I made one offer to help Anderson Holdings with the Savannah Bridge situation, and you declined it. I sat at your table for 4 years and answered questions about my work and explained what I do, and you nodded. Every time you nodded." He didn't speak. "Last Tuesday, you had a choice about how you spoke to me in that room," I said. "You made one." Another silence. "Can we fix this?" he asked. This is the question, the one that everything had been building toward since 1:47 on Tuesday afternoon. And I want to tell you something true about the moment he asked it. I did not feel triumphant. That's important. I've thought about this carefully, and I want to be precise. I did not sit there feeling the warm heat of having won something. What I felt was closer to tired. Tired of being someone's afterthought. Tired of being adjacent to a family instead of in it. "That's up to you," I said. "I want to make it right," he said. "The Nashville project needs—" "I know what Nashville needs," I said. "I've known what Nashville needs for 3 weeks. That's not what I'm talking about." He waited. "I'm talking about the fact that you have spent 4 years deciding who I am," I said. "And you were wrong. And the only reason you're sitting in this room right now is because a project you care about is in trouble. Not because you woke up this morning and thought, 'Let me go understand my son-in-law.'" I said it without heat. Just the fact of it. That's the thing I need you to actually hear. The longest silence of the afternoon. "You're right," Richard Anderson said. It was a small sentence. But for a man like Richard, who had spent 61 years being the largest presence in every room he entered, it cost something. I could see that it cost something. I nodded once. "Daniel will send you a revised engagement letter," I said. "The terms have changed from our original proposal. Our equity stake is higher now. The fee structure reflects our carrying costs during the interruption, and I'll need formal acknowledgement from the Anderson Holdings board of the Reeves Capital role in this transaction, in writing, before we recommit." Richard looked at me. Something that might have been respect. I don't know if it was genuine or just the particular expression a man wears when he recognizes that the other person at the table has won. "That's fair," he said. "One more thing," I said. He waited. "Sophia," I said, "the next time you need to reach me about something that involves my professional life, you call me. Directly. Not through her." A pause. "Agreed." I stood up. I shook his hand. I walked him to the elevator. The Nashville deal closed 14 months later. Reeves Capital anchored the institutional equity raise at $52 million. We brought in Carolina's institutional partners, the Dallas family office, and a pension fund advisory group out of Nashville itself that Daniel had cultivated for 2 years. The total project capitalization came in at $380 million. Anderson Holdings' participation, which they had structured as a GP promote, was significant. It was the largest transaction in the company's history. At the closing dinner at Etch Restaurant in Nashville, Richard stood up and gave a toast. He talked about the project, the team, the developer. He talked about what it had taken to get there. And then he looked at me across the table and he said, "None of this happens without my son-in-law." He said it clearly. No qualification, no hedge, just the fact. Sophia reached for my hand. I looked at Richard Anderson across that table, and I thought about a man laughing in a boardroom in Columbia, South Carolina. And I thought about 11 seconds and a text message, and 9 minutes and 40 seconds. And I thought about what it means to build something so completely, so quietly, so precisely, that by the time the people who underestimated you finally see it, there's nothing left to argue about. There's a particular kind of quiet that follows that. Not the cold kind. Not the kind that presses down. The other kind. The kind that comes when something has been said that needed to be said, and the room has finally heard it. I held my wife's hand. I raised my glass, and I let the moment be exactly what it was,